In a small town in America, there was a bakery owned by a man who was very good at baking bread and cakes. His name was Mr. Baker. Mr. Baker's bread was the softest bread anyone had ever tasted, and his cakes were the yummiest treats. People from all over the town came to his shop to buy his delicious goodies. But Mr. Baker was not a very nice man. He always gave his customers just the right amount of bread they paid for and never gave them extra. He also never smiled or talked kindly. He was always serious and grumpy. Even though he made the best bread and cakes, Mr. Baker had a problem. The smell of his baking was so wonderful that some people would stand outside his shop, just smelling the air. They didn't buy anything, but they enjoyed the yummy smells. Mr. Baker didn't like this at all. He thought, "These people are getting a free lunch from the smell of my bread. I work hard to make this bread, and they are not paying me for it." He wondered if there was a way to sell the smell of his bread, just like he sold the bread itself. Maybe he could put the smells in bottles and sell them to people who wanted to enjoy the aroma without buying the bread. Mr. Baker decided to think of a way to make this idea work. Every day, as Mr. Baker baked bread and cakes, the wonderful smells spread out into the streets. The fresh bread smelled so good that it made people's tummies rumble. When people walked by his shop, they could smell the delicious aroma from far away. Some came into the shop to buy bread and cakes because they were so tempted by the smell. They were always happy to pay for the yummy treats they got. They loved the soft bread and sweet cakes that Mr. Baker made. But not everyone went inside. Some people just stopped outside the shop and took deep breaths, enjoying the wonderful smells. They looked through the windows, wishing they could have a taste of the treats inside. Mr. Baker noticed this and felt very frustrated. Why should they get to enjoy the smell for free? He grumbled to himself. I work so hard to make these smells, and I'm not getting anything for it. He thought it wasn't fair that people could just stand outside and smell the bread without paying. Mr. Baker wanted to find a way to make sure everyone paid for the wonderful smells, not just for the bread and cakes. Mr. Baker's frustration grew with each passing day. Every morning, as he prepared his dough and baked his bread, he could see people standing outside, sniffing the air and smiling with joy. It made him feel angry and annoyed. He watched as they enjoyed the smell of his fresh bread and cakes, but they never came inside to buy anything. To Mr. Baker, it felt like they were taking advantage of his hard work without giving him anything in return. He thought hard about how he could fix this problem. Maybe, if I could bottle the smell, I could sell it just like I sell my bread, he thought. That way, people who want to enjoy the smell without buying anything would have to pay. Mr. Baker began to think about how he could create bottles that would capture the aroma of his baking. He imagined people buying these bottles and enjoying the smell of his bread and cakes, even when they weren't at his shop. He was determined to find a way to make his idea work. If he could sell the smells, he thought, he might finally get the payment he felt he deserved for all his hard work. One chilly winter morning, Mr. Baker was busy in his shop. He was making a fresh batch of bread, but he wasn't very happy. He complained about how early he had to get up and how cold it was outside. As he worked, he grumbled to himself, "Why do I have to get up so early? It's so cold, and I'm so tired of all this." He wasn't enjoying his baking at all. While he was working, he glanced up and saw someone standing outside the window. The person was a young man wearing an old, worn coat. The young man was looking at the bread with hungry eyes and a big smile on his face. Mr. Baker could see that the young man was smelling the fresh bread with delight. This made Mr. Baker even angrier. "That young man is getting a free breakfast just from the smell of my bread," he shouted. "I'm working hard to make this bread, and he's not paying a single penny." The young man continued to stand outside, happily enjoying the smell of the bread, completely unaware of how angry Mr. Baker was. Mr. Baker's anger boiled over. He marched outside, pushed open the shop door, and yelled at the young man. "You have to pay for the smells you're taking from my shop," he demanded. The young man was startled and confused. "Pay for what?" he asked. "I'm just smelling the air. The air is free." "It's not free when it's full of the smells from my bakery," Mr. Baker replied. "I work hard to make these smells, and you're enjoying them without paying me." The young man tried to explain that he wasn't taking anything, just enjoying the smell. But Mr. Baker was too angry to listen. He insisted that the young man pay for the smells, or he would call the police. When the young man didn't pay, Mr. Baker grabbed him by the coat and pulled him through the snow. He was determined to take the young man to the judge to settle the matter. Mr. Baker and the young man arrived at the judge's house early in the morning. The judge was still in his pajamas, looking sleepy and confused. "What's going on?" the judge asked, opening the door to find Mr. Baker and the young man standing outside. It was very early, and he couldn't understand why they were there. "This man is a thief," Mr. Baker said. "He stole the smells from my bakery without paying." The judge was surprised by this claim, but decided to listen to both sides. "Come in," he said. "I will hear your stories. But first, let me get dressed." The judge went back inside, and after a few minutes, he returned in his regular clothes. He invited Mr. Baker and the young man to sit down at a large table. They were all ready to explain what happened. Mr. Baker started telling his story. He explained how the young man was standing outside his shop, enjoying the smells of his bread without buying anything. "He's stealing the smells from my bakery," Mr. Baker said. The young man then told his side of the story. "I wasn't stealing anything," he said. "I was just smelling the air. Air is free, and I wasn't taking anything from the bakery." The judge listened carefully to both stories. He thought about what they had said and tried to understand the situation. After hearing both sides, he was ready to make a decision. The judge thought carefully about what he had heard. He understood that Mr. Baker's smells were coming from his shop and that they belonged to him. He also knew that the young man was enjoying the smells, but had not taken anything physical. The judge decided that the young man should pay for the smells he enjoyed. He asked the young man if he had any money. The young man took out a few coins and showed them to the judge. The judge took the coins and shook them so they made a clinking sound. "These coins will pay for the smells," he said to Mr. Baker. Mr. Baker was pleased and reached out for the money, but the judge did not give it to him. Instead, the judge shook the coins and said, "The sound of the money is the best way to pay for the smell of bread." Mr. Baker was surprised and confused. He had expected to get the coins, but the judge was giving them back to the young man. "Give me my coins," Mr. Baker demanded. "No," said the judge. "I have decided that the sound of money is the best way to pay for the smells. You will not receive the coins." The judge returned the coins to the young man and told him to go home. The young man was relieved and left happily. Mr. Baker was left thinking about what had happened. He began to understand that smells couldn't be sold, and that the judge's decision made sense in a way. The young man went home with his coins, feeling happy that he didn't have to pay for something he hadn't really taken. He was glad that the judge had helped him. Mr. Baker stayed behind, reflecting on the judge's decision. He realized that he had learned something important about the value of his work and the concept of payment. He started to think about how he could be kinder and perhaps even smile once in a while. From that day on, Mr. Baker's attitude began to change. He still made delicious bread and cakes, but he also tried to be more understanding and less focused on the smells and the money. And so, life in the small town continued with a new sense of fairness and kindness.